Hi, it's Pastor Steve. We're continuing our journey through the Bible, cover to cover, and today is January 4, and what we are looking at is Genesis chapter 11 through 14. Now things are heating up. Now I've mentioned most of Genesis is a narrative format, and we're going to see not only instructions from God, but we're also going to see how people live their lives, and we're going to see good things, we're going to see bad things. But why today is so important is because now we have the foundations of the Jewish people. We have the foundations of really the unfolding of Christianity even, because it all begins with this man who lived in Ur of the Chaldees named Abraham. God goes to Abraham and says, "Go to the place that I will show you." Now, there are many intriguing things about this because Abraham's family is really pagans. In other words, there may be some residue or remembrance of Yahweh or the God who created heavens and the earth, but at this time, the world has moved to having people with many gods, and we're going to see that unfold. But God goes to one man, Abraham, and his wife, Sarai, and says, "Go to the place where I will show you." And that place turns out to be what ultimately is called Canaan, or what would be modern-day Israel. And he begins that journey. Now, here is an important prophecy that God says to Abraham that impacts all of us today. That's surprising. The prophecy is this: because of you, all the nations will be blessed. Now, how is that possible? How is one person, one man, Abraham, and his life going to ultimately bless all the peoples of the world? People who study this, particularly in Christian circles, see this as ultimately a prophecy of Jesus, because Jesus is a descendant of Abraham, and because of Jesus and the salvation that he offers through his shed blood and his resurrection, we have that possibility of salvation. And so this passage, particularly starting in chapter 12, gives us that foundation work. Now, as we look at this passage, there are some interesting narrative stories. And here's a wonderful example of a narrative that is not teaching us something, it's just telling us what happened. There is a point in which Abraham goes to Egypt, and he pawns off his wife, Sarai, as being his sister, because he feared, hey, my wife is a real looker, and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is going to see her and want to take her into his chamber. And so to protect his life, he says, "Oh, she's my sister." And you're saying, well, what advantage is that to you? Do you want Pharaoh to sleep with your wife? And ultimately, Pharaoh brings her into his household because she indeed is beautiful. But then he finds everyone getting sick, and his country is like cursed, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. Well, Abraham ultimately reveals, actually, she's my wife. She's kind of my sister, but she's also my wife. And Pharaoh says, "Why did you do this?" Now, when you look at a story like that, you say, why is this in the Bible? It's telling us the story of what happened with Abraham and his dysfunctional relationship with his wife Sarai, and how his mind works. And what we find is that this narrative is not saying, "Go and do likewise." It's just telling us what happened. The camera was rolling, and you're going to bump into narrative passages like that. But in this narrative passage includes the Lord speaking and saying, "Every nation will be blessed because of you." That is a keeper. That is something that's going to carry us through. The story in Egypt, well, that's letting us know what happened. It's not blessing it. It's not telling us go and do likewise, but it is letting us know that this happened in Abraham's life. But then there is his nephew Lot, who gets in trouble, and there are these 5 kings chasing him, and Abraham comes to the rescue. Now, this has another interesting element in the story, because he chases these 5 kings to a city called Dan. Now, Dan is the name of one of Jacob's sons. Now, Abraham has a son, his name is Isaac. Isaac has a son, his name is Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, one of them is named Dan, who ultimately settles after they come back from their captivity in Egypt in the northern part of Israel, and that place is called Dan. So how in creation could Abraham be chasing these 5 kings and rescuing Lot as far as a city that does not exist yet? Well, the answer is that happens in the scripture from time to time. It's where the author is giving his readers a name that they will recognize, because they would not recognize what that city would have been called at that time. For example, if in the United States, if you went to what would be modern-day Chicago in the year 1800, it was probably some Indian name that nobody would know today. But if you said he settled in the Chicago area, well, Chicago wasn't founded as a city till the 1840s, but that would give people who are reading it a handle on that name. That's what's happening with the name Dan. Now, there's one other interesting thing in this passage, which is Abraham, on his way back, meets the king of Salem. Now, Salem means peace, but that is the king of a city that later on will be known as Jerusalem. And there, this man named Melchizedek, who is very little information about him, he seems to be very important. And Abraham knows how important he is, and he gives him 1/10 of everything he has. Now, Melchizedek is an interesting character for a number of reasons. One is the author of Hebrews in the New Testament is going to talk about him as a type of Christ, of Jesus. Some people think Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate visitation of Jesus. Now, the evidence for that is through numerous passages in Scripture, moving on all the way to the book of Revelation. Is this a the pre-incarnation visit of Jesus? We don't know. But we do know that this visit of Abraham to Melchizedek takes on a significant meaning in the whole of the Bible. So it is worth knowing this passage and seeing Abraham's reverence to this person, which we will find out more as we move forward. God bless you. Have a great day.